Hi, this is Jiun. As scrunchies are so popular recently, I decided to make a speed comparison of 3 types of scrunchie sewing method. And at the end of this video, I'm going to show you a step-by-step sewing tutorial for the quickest method. I've prepared 4 types of fabric to see the effect when they are turned into a scrunchie. I cut 3 of them in the same length for the comparison, and for the cotton poplin, I make it 65 cm in length for the tutorial. As the fabric that we are going to sew is rather thin, I changed the sewing machine needle to Shamet Microtex needle size 60/8 that is specially designed for thin and delicate fabric. Seeing that this organza is translucent, the fabric edge will not be completely hidden, and it is quite fragile. I'll do single fold hem along the shorter edge and a French seam for the longer side. I'll fold the shorter edge by 5 mm and straight stitch over it. Then we're going to do the finishing for the longer side. As a French seam comprises 2 stitching, I will stitch one of them beforehand and save the other for the comparison. First, I sew the first stitch wrong side together. Then, I trim the seam allowance narrower before I flip it inside out. After that, I prepare the elastic band for the scrunchies. I actually wrap the measuring tape around my ponytails and the circumference is 10 cm. So I make it 16 cm with 2 cm of seam allowance included. You can make it longer or shorter according to your hair volume. And I'm ready for the sewing. I'm going to start with the most common way of sewing, the traditional way. We form a long tube by half folding the fabric lengthwise and stitch. Then, turn it inside out, insert the elastic band, and connect 2 shorter edges by machine or hand sewing. I'm going to sew with the organza fabric. As it is already half folded, so I start with sewing the second stitch along the longer edge. But I realized that I need to iron press the edge to make it easier to sew. So I stop the timer and start ironing. Then I start the timer and continue with the sewing. And because the fabric is 20 cm wide, I'm able to flip it inside out without using any tools, as normally we need a loop turner for that. And I'm surprised that I can gather the tube around my finger, and it makes inserting the elastic so much easier. I connect the elastic with a few stitches. And I arrange the fabric direction. I sew part of the opening right side together with machine, and then leave a 5 cm opening for the hand sewing. I actually struggled a bit with the sewing, as there are too much of fabric gathered at one point, and it's difficult to hold 2 layers of fabric flat and sew. It takes me 19 minutes 31 seconds for this organza scrunchie. And I move on to the burrito method. With this method, we're going to make it into a band before forming a tube. So we need to half fold it widthwise, right side together and sew. After that, lay it flat on the table, fold the upper layer in to keep them aside, and align the bottom layer right side together and sew. At the end of your sewing, leave a 4 cm gap unsewn, and we're going to use this opening to turn the whole scrunchie inside out. Then, we insert the elastic and connect two ends to make it into a band, and hand sew the opening close. And this time, I'm going to use this emerald green chiffon. This is a light and thin material, and usually it's not easy to handle, but with the microtex needle, it's easy to sew. I half fold and stitch the shorter side right side together. Then, I do the burrito wrapping and sew along the longer side. It is important to align the seam perfectly to make sure it looks good from the outside. I leave a 4 cm gap unsewn. As this chiffon is thin, it is very easy to turn it inside out. And now I need to insert the elastic band. At first, I thought that I could wrap them around my fingers like the previous one, but I failed. So I used the safety pin to insert the elastic into it. I sew it into a band with a few stitches. And trim off the loose thread. Lastly, I hand sew the opening close. And this chiffon scrunchie is done in 19 minutes 5 seconds. And finally, we could do the last method. I name it Wrap the Elastic Way. The sewing steps are very similar to the previous one, but for this one, we're going to sew the elastic into a band beforehand. Then, as we are doing the burrito wrap, we're going to wrap the elastic band at the same time. That means we pass the fabric through the elastic band when we are sewing the longer edge. Leave a 4 cm gap unsewn, and we're going to use this opening to turn the whole scrunchie inside out. And hand sew the opening close. So for this method, I'm going to use this stretch satin fabric. First, I sew the elastic into a band, stitching back and forth to make sure that it's sturdy enough. Then, I took the fabric and half folded widthwise, right side together, and sew along the shorter edge. I press open the seam with an iron. Before doing the burrito wrap, I place the elastic in the middle of the fabric and wrap the elastic band at the same time. While I'm sewing, I'm going to pull one layer of the fabric through the elastic band and sew at 1 cm along the longer edge. At the end of the sewing, I leave a 4 cm gap unsewn and backstitch. So I'm going to flip the scrunchie inside out with this hole. But the 4 cm hole turns out too small for me to flip it inside out, so I cut open the gap to ease the process. To finish it, I hand sew the opening close. I quite like this method as we don't need to insert the elastic and sew it into a band when there's a bunch of fabric. So this satin scrunchie took 16 minutes 57 seconds to finish. Now let's take a look at what I have sewn. And the winner goes to the third one, the Wrap the Elastic Method. They are the largest scrunchies that I've made so far, and the diameter is 16 cm. But if I'm gonna remake these scrunchies, I'm gonna adjust the length by 10 to 20 cm, make it shorter for a thick fabric and longer for a thinner fabric. So finally, it's our tutorial time. Take the elastic and we're gonna sew it into a band. Simply overlap the two ends for around 2 cm and sew a rectangle to secure it. Follow the graphic that I have drawn. Sew the first line on the weave and stop before you reach the edge. Then keep the needle down in the elastic. Turn the elastic band 90 degrees and continue with the sewing. Stop before you reach the elastic end and keep the needle down again. Raise up the presser foot. Turn the elastic 90 degrees and repeat the steps until you finish sewing four edges. And when your last stitch meets with the first stitch, you can go back and forth on the first stitching, or you can go a few rounds to make it extra secure. Then we move on to the fabric piece. Before we start sewing this fabric, we need to make sure that the length of both edges is equal, so that they can match perfectly when we sew them together. Half fold it widthwise, face the right side to right side, and straight stitch at 1 cm along the shorter edge. I start and end the stitching with alternative back stitch, but you can do 3 to 4 reverse stitches to replace that. After that, we're gonna iron the seam and iron open the seam flat. So now, move the seam to the center and face it down. Fold the upper layer in like this, then bring up the bottom layer. And you'll notice that you are actually grabbing the seam. Take the elastic band, place it on top of the fabric, and pass one of the bottom layer through the elastic band. Grab the other one, align the seam, and we're going to sew along this edge. It will be better if you can secure the two seams in place with a tailor needle, or you can quickly place it under the footer and press it down. Secure it with a few reverse stitches. After that, stop sewing and keep the needle position down inside the fabric. Gently pull the upper layer fabric through the elastic band. Align the edges and continue to sew. So you're gonna repeat the steps, keep pulling out more fabric and continue with the sewing. It might look a bit complicated, but trust me, it is easier than you think. As you are sewing along the longer edge of this fabric piece, you will eventually reaching the starting point where you find the seam is. So now, stop at 5 cm away from the starting point and do 3 to 4 reverse stitches. And we are done with the sewing. With the machine. It looks like this, and this is the wrong side of the fabric, and they wrap around the elastic band. Now we're gonna flip it inside out through this hole. Gently pull the fabric and the elastic band out. And there you are, you got a scrunchie. We are almost done. Last step, we're gonna sew this opening close. I tidy out the scrunchies a bit and fold 1 cm seam allowance in at this opening. You can choose to edge stitch along this opening or hand sew it close with an invisible stitch. But now, I'm going to hand sew this close as it is invisible and it will not create a flat edge. Prepare a thread by tying a knot at the end. If you are right-handed, you're gonna sew from the right to the left. And if you are left-handed, you're gonna sew from the other side. To make the knot invisible, I push the first stitch from the inside and outwards, right on the edge. Then, we're gonna sew along this folded edge. We're gonna make every stitch 2 to 3 mm. And we switch between two edges. Make sure that the ending point of this current stitch is at the same level of the starting point of the next stitch. So after you have a rough idea on how and where are we going to sew, I'm going to show you a faster version. So we push the needle into the fabric in an S motion. Sew along the edge and make sure that you only pick up one layer of fabric at a time. And after a few stitches, pull the needle out of the fabric and make sure that the fabric lays flat. And now you can choose which version to use to sew the opening close. When you have reached the ending point, turn the scrunchie to the other side and sew through the 3 cm of reverse stitch before cutting off the thread. This is to ensure that it will not open up when we pull it apart. Now, cut off the thread and any loose thread you found along the seam, and it is done. This is a really good project to use up big scrap fabric, and you can also stitch a few pieces of fabric together to get a long piece. I hope you find this helpful, and I will see you next time.